Okay, what's going on? Sa Wagwegu, Gatita Guts the Yuchuts. My English name is Lindsay Delaronde. I am the Indigenous Resurgence Coordinator for the Fine Arts Department. This series called the Blue Heron series is reaching out to artists, activists, educators, knowledge keepers to really be in that place of deep reflection, which the Blue Heron teaches us, to share information with compassion and dignity. At this time during COVID-19, a time of isolation, a time of self-reflection, a time of really slowing down. I think this is a really good opportunity to really see where people are at and the things that have sort of emerged in this time. Also, the other layers of violence and the resurgence of everything that the civil rights movement has brought into this COVID-19. And I mean, there's a lot of complexities, racial identity politics. And so we're really living in a very heated moment. And so each artist has been able to really, I think, sink in and really be able to, I think, express from a place of, deep passion, that's sometimes not always cultivated in interviews, or there's always sort of an underlying agenda. But this conversation is really about seeing where you've been at in this time of isolation and how you've been able to, maintain your arts practice. And so when I thought of people to interview, when I thought of the people that have influenced me in my work and where I could see parallels and similarities, Quill, your work and you definitely came into my thoughts. And I just really wanted to reach out as a gesture of appreciation, as a gesture of honoring the work that you've been doing, in your education, in your own life experiences that manifest through your work, but also the work that you've been holding for Indigenous youth to really, understand settler colonialism. And I think it's such a beautiful, message and a place that you're laying a resting place for Indigenous youth to really kind of sift through a lot of these complexities, and then doing it with artistically, I think, is a real beautiful way to give Indigenous youth voice. So I just wanted to start off that interview and thank you for your time. Maybe I'll allow you to do your own introduction and we'll just kind of have a casual conversation about art, decolonization, and whatever else emerges.
Yeah, so Gagge Taste Gobik Indigenakaj Wajish Gindodem Thunderbe and Dunjaba. My name is Quill Christie-Peters. I'm Anishinaabe from Treaty 3 territory, which is like Northwestern Ontario, but I live here in Thunder Bay. I'm pregnant. I feel like I need to say that in the interview because it's going to inform a lot of what I say, but also sometimes I just lose my thought. So just bear with me if I'm like a little bit, sometimes it's hard for me to communicate these days. But yeah, I'm an artist and I work with youth. I write, and yeah, that's my little introduction.
Okay, thank you for that. Maybe as I was kind of looking at your work, reviewing your work, the writings in particular, you have this very poetic way of writing your literature and really addressing violence against women's bodies and violence against the land and talking about displacement and disconnection. Where do you feel in your influences? How have you emerged into bringing these themes and topics into your work?
Yeah, I think for me it's been a really interesting journey between like visual art and then transitioning to like written work, and then most recently transitioning to like tattoo work.
Right.
Has been really like amazing conversation between all disciplines in regards to like where I was able to like interrogate my body as like a site of settler colonialism.
Right.
So I think, like, I've always been a painter, and in my early 20s, I felt resourced enough to like explicitly explore painting my own body and interrogating, like settler colonial violence, but also pleasure. But the next step from that was like writing about it, which kind of like was a different level of engagement with those themes and really challenging to like put into more literal words those violences. And then to see that then translate to a practice of actually like marking the body has just been a privilege and an honor for me to like witness the like continuum of that work, and now to be creating a body in a body.
Wow.
Another continuum of that work that I'm sure will continue to evolve like over my life. But for me, it was just being resourced enough to look at my own experiences of violence and to start articulating that into words so that it could shape others or shape myself too.
Interesting. The style and aesthetics, how you paint. I was looking at your paintings this morning, and it's from the woodland style, the Anishinaabe aesthetics of painting are within your visual language, but there's something very different also about your style. Some of the familiarity of woodland style is present, and then I feel like there's this new rendering or this style of painting that is very much your work. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of like the visual language that that you're putting into your work? I mean, I think what I really love about your work the most is the spirituality of it. Like really this conversation, almost being like a conduit from the other side, from that spiritual side, from the ancestors. Do you feel comfortable talking about that and how that translates into the forms and into the paintings?
I can try, because I always struggle with
Mm,
articulating certain visual choices because I'm not really sure where they come from for myself.
right.
My dad's a painter, which I think is important to acknowledge.
Mm,
And there's lots of similarities between our work, but there's also a lot of differences. But I like to think that we're both informed through our ancestors, and that's where like the similarity in our work comes from. For like my style, I actually have no idea really where it comes from. I mean, I typically I really like to work in layers, and I like to spend a lot of time on each layer. So even if I know something's going to be painted over, I'll still paint it in its entirety and properly. And then if it gets painted over, it gets painted over. And I think where I really like sit with the intention behind the work, and like I'm in a way in conversation with my ancestors and that are shaping that painting. So I think the time that I spend is really integral to the style. Colors, I mean, I love colors, but I do tend to just wing it. Like I don't. The sketches for my paintings are really poor and not thought out, but it always just seems to like come together at the very end.
Wow.
But yeah, I don't know. Like I grew up in Toronto, so I didn't have a lot of access to like woodland style art or anything like that. My main engagement with Native art was just through my dad and through like selling his art on like street corners with him and watching him paint and carve. But it's always just been, I don't know, not like a practice for me. Like it's not something I had to necessarily develop, it's always felt like a really, like one of my languages, like a way that I just will always like articulate things.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so I always reflect on that because I feel really grateful to have that, and
Mm-hmm.
to, yeah, it's also amazing for me to see a painting come together because I'm like, what? I don't know. Like, it all worked out somehow, you know?
Right. Well, I
Yeah.
think that's the beauty of creativity, you know, and I think it's also the beauty of some of the work that, I mean, I think there's two sides of that. I think the struggle of being an Indigenous woman in Canada, you know, and having that intergenerational impact of, you know, our parents, our grandparents, our great grandparents, that residue that's left in our lifetimes. I always parallel, you know, the being a good receptor. How do we receive the information from the other side? How do we engage in these spiritual conversations with our ancestors, knowing that, you know, that having a healthy mind, body, and spirit is part of being able to receive. And so what I also see in your work, in relation to some of that fluidity, is that radical self-love that you talk about, that you expose in your work as putting your own body, you know, even after all of what we recognize that impacts us, and then being able to having to address that, having to clear those passages, having to do, you know, that inner work, the healing work. Do you see your work as being, you know, part of a healing process? Is there an intentional therapeutic um, way that you work to be able to manifest your paintings, your writings, your tattoos?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're healing for me, and I I make them with the intention of healing for myself and like my family first and foremost. And I see the ways that that spills over to other people who engage with my art. Um, but for me, sometimes like healing is very unintentional, and uh, like doesn't necessarily come from me being like, okay, I'm ready to deal with this, I'm going to paint myself. It's just sometimes feels like I'm being pushed from like my ancestors and different
Mm,
forces in my life. Like when I did do that series of work around my own body, I wasn't like, oh, I'm going to heal from this. I was just like, oh, I'll just like, I feel like painting this and I'm going to do it. And then afterwards, I like died a little bit because it was like just witnessing all this stuff that maybe I couldn't put into words or even to thoughts.
right.
So for me, sometimes the healing process, it's just so not linear.
Mm,
And, but I do try to, uh, like continue the work in a way that can help contextualize the healing. So that's why I decided to like write about those pieces,
right.
because a lot of people look at them and don't necessarily get the messages behind it. And yeah, it's been kind of more of like a circular healing process to see how those works have impacted my life, but also, you know, my mom and my dad are really referenced in those paintings, as well as like people I come from who have also experienced violence on their bodies. And so for
Mm-hmm.
me, yeah, it's the greatest gift when I see that healing work like spilling out,
Yeah.
but it's not always like so intentional and linear. It's often like very chaotic and
Mm,
painful and messy and
mm. Wow. I really, would you say that, you know, when we talk about like the spirituality and that conversation with the ancestors, you know, in the institution, they talk a lot about, you know, like decolonizing arts. They're wanting to indigenize, you know, they're wanting to have Indigenous content. They're wanting to have Indigenous retention and all of this. Do you think that the institution, for example, in your experience, holds this type of work? understands it? Like, how have people received your work and your experience, you know, cultivating sort of the youth vision in your Indigenous governance, looking at art as governance and creating a framework and a structure that you could provide to community, a process that community can move through. What is your experience, I guess, paralleling or connecting the work that you've done in the institution and having the right support to be able to go out into the world and do this work?
Yeah, I guess I feel like the institution has never helped me in that regard and never properly held that work.
Mm,
As a as myself, as like an artist, I don't really engage with institutions. Like I always feel like a fraud because I don't have like shows and stuff.
right,
I
right.
don't really do exhibitions or um, a lot of the artwork like just is in my house
Right.
and shown to my family and
Mm,
uh, I've
mm,
done a show here and there, but it typically doesn't give me much. So
mhm.
yeah, as an artist, I don't feel like those spaces deserve this work. And I know that I can get them to the people who need to see them on my own.
Yeah.
When it comes to doing collective work, like my youth work and stuff, I did start out in institutions and I honestly feel like doing the type of work that I do that's has integrity to like Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous ways of relating to art
Mhm.
just was like nearly impossible, at least in the spaces that I worked in.
Yeah.
I would do just as much work defending and like rationalizing what I was doing to the institution than I would towards the actual youth and like that sort of like really generative work.
Mhm.
Um, so, in my opinion, there's just so much that needs to be done in these spaces.
Right.
I
Right.
find that when it comes to this type of work, an institution won't be able to comprehend what we're doing, and we'll never probably be able to comprehend what we're doing because it's so much about um, our ancestors and our homelands and our bodies in a way that either they won't be invited into that conversation. And so for me, that was the real like where I would come up like head to head with them is they would want to understand it to shape it in alignment with how they do things. And then
Mhm.
on top of that, just being actually like a lot of institutions are overtly harmful to Indigenous youth through like security, through front of house staff, um,
Yeah.
those those layers of actual violence that happen in that space just made it not worth it for me. So I
Mhm.
started doing the youth work independent and just like mostly on the land or um, with galleries, but in a very kind of like uh, bounded way where it's like, can you let us use the space, but you're not, that's it. Like,
Right.
can we literally rent the space?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of trust, you know, that I think that needs to be established. And I think that's one thing that institutions, they feel entitled to be able to insert the work or have a say if the work is being done within that institution. So I think what, you know, what I'm interpreting, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a lot about boundaries and a lot about safety, creating parameters that are self-determined by the artist, hence yourself, like really taking a critical stand at the way Western art functions that I think Indigenous art can function or sometimes bleeds or there's an overlap there. So there's something really, I think, powerful in the way that an artist can really self-determine who gets access, you know, who gets access, when, why, what is the reasoning, what is the intention. I mean, you're speaking about, you know, upholding, you know, those sacred relationships about your parents, you know, having that really at the heart of, you know, your urges and motivation and desire, and then moving that work into youth. I mean, and also creating a lot of safety for youth to be able to also go inward. I think that's something that, Indigenous artists within the institution, it's an internal, external sort of relationship. Those themes that they're talking about are not in theory. We actually live through colonial violence and have intergenerationally. And so to be able to, research this information and reclaim identity, body, sexuality. How has people received your work, your community? Both good and bad. I mean, I know critique for anyone who puts their work out there has the opportunity to hear sort of, things that people are receiving from the work and sometimes misinterpreting the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those works around pleasure were definitely controversial to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I never received any unfair critique or aggressive critique from Native people, only from white people. White people hated that work and they'd messaged me, and so many things have happened from that work that put me in an unsafe position as a Native woman. So, but for me, it's just the most important that I made those works for myself, and I made them for my dad, and particularly family members who have gone to residential school. So that if that painting makes them feel just a little bit better, that's good for me. But I have received a lot of positive feedback from people in my community and from this larger Instagram community too, about how those works have shaped their relationship to their body and to pleasure. But definitely the white response to that work was very aggressive and very scary. And at the time it was really hard and emotional, but now that I'm kind of past it, it's I think an indicator of the work, of the quality of the work. And I don't want to create work that's palatable to settler colonialism. I don't. And so I do value that critique from white people, that they think it's disgusting or whatever, because I know it's really unsettling to them to see the power of me feeling pleasure in my body and feeling deserving of pleasure in my body, and to see those stories painted on my body of where I come from and where I'll go. I don't mind making those people upset.
Okay, I'm just gonna say goodbye to my little baby. Love you. We'll see you later. Okay. That's interesting as well, because sometimes I feel like the institution doesn't have the capacity to receive what we're trying to offer, or trying to really, I think, we're in the institution, we're at the mercy of the way the institution functions. I think regardless if it's Indigenous focused, it's still the academy. The academy will always be what it will be, which means that, that hierarchy of power is always overhanging. Are we valid enough? Are we good enough? So I really love that, your experience within it, but also being able to critique it from the outside, really recognizing, the many shortcomings that it has. And I think your type of work, it's provocative, but it's also where I think people that haven't really got it yet about what's happening to and what has happened to Indigenous women in this country, through generations of violence and displacement. I think it's another action of dismissal and deflection truth. They can't sort of embody it. There's no capacity building to be able to have an empathetic or a willingness to engage deeper in the work. I mean, because I think, you know, your paintings and your writing is not just visually pleasing in a way that, you know, your compositions and your forms. And I mean, there's a lot of layers going on in your work, you know, like you talked about your color paddling, these forms that kind of emerge, the spiritual aspect of your work. It's really deep. It's really deep. It really, actually going through some of your writings today, I think it's really beautiful how you started to emerge from the visual into more of the writing to build a bigger container to contextualize the work. And then now going into, you know, the tattooing and embodying these images like visually as a marking. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking a lot about like the parallels between my work as well. How has your experience been with, you know, working with other women? Is that something that is really important to you to really kind of be in counsel, in conversation as you're exploring, you know, self-love, radical self-love, being in a good place? How has those conversations changed your interaction with other females? Other.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I feel like a lot of my work is informed through this, like, my web of relationships with
Mm,
my friends and
mhm,
my family, but like I do have a really solid group of friends that like hold me and
mm,
hold this work. Um, I've always been kind of like a more private person when it comes to my artwork, so
right, right.
I don't necessarily go to like a group of people and ask for like feedback or critique. But
Mhm,
I think that that like web of relationships is inherently forming, like informing that work all the time.
mhm,
Um, but yeah, it's definitely, it's all connected. And I think for me at this moment anyways, I'm really reflecting on how um, how many different forms of creation we're always all participating in. And for me, like, to paint is just one form of creation, and to do all these other things that I do in my life is also creation. And
mhm,
that's really, I think, important for me in this conversation around interacting with institutions, but also who I am as an artist is
mm,
like there is no hierarchy between the different forms of creation that I'm
mm,
invested in my life. Like I think it's just me trying to articulate my worldview and who I am.
mm,
And I firmly believe that all like Anishinaabeg people and all of my family are always investing in these forms of creation and creating different things.
mm,
So for me, it's hard to answer a question like, how has like, yeah, if I seek counsel or if it's like changed my relationships to other people, because it's just like a big web for me.
mm,
Um, and I feel that even more strongly with being pregnant. It's like
mm,
that's definitely important. It's an important form of creation that I'm
mm.
taking a lot of my energy, but it's
Right,
not different. It's not different for me than like creating paintings or
mm,
um, creating relationships or
mhm,
yeah, tattooing. Like it's all one continuum for me. And so that's the biggest teaching for me being pregnant, is just to realize all the different diversity of creation. And
mm,
that's how I live. And so when I go into an institution where it's very compartmentalized, um,
right,
it just doesn't work.
right.
Um, it could work if maybe
Mhm,
people are ready to cede a little bit of control and just focus on getting resources to the
mhm,
people who need it.
right.
But as it stands, that way of relating to art, which to me is also life, just doesn't it's just not, doesn't work in the institution.
Right. It
Yeah.
sounds like a lot of your worldview that you're talking about coming from an Anishinaabe worldview, coming from an Indigenous centered worldview, and how, the interconnectedness of everything. Sounds like it's really the way that, um, you're keeping life force in your life alive and nourishing that. Um, and I guess maybe, do you have your, through your work and through your education and your life experience, have you been able to define what, or do you have your own definition or understanding of what decolonizing looks like? I mean, it's a word thrown around in the institution a lot. It's something in terms of even my own perception of it, in terms of resisting colonialism, resisting settler colonialism. Every turn we have to kind of address it. And so when we look at decolonization, how do you understand decolonization in your own life?
Yeah, I guess for me, decolonization is just, it's like a mixture of both like resistance and being like actively anti-colonial, and
Mm,
recognizing the privilege in understanding those systems and seeking to give that to other people like youth.
mm-hmm,
um, but it's also an equal amount of just returning to myself, and like uh,
mm,
a lot of it actually for me anyways is just reclaiming validity around my way of being. Like, I've always been this way,
yeah,
and it's just like a lifelong process to see those parts of myself as valid. um,
mm,
Especially like, yeah, as someone who has to interact with like institutions all the time and who has gone through like
mhm,
education and
yeah,
all that kind of stuff. It's just for me mostly about yeah, internally feeling valid and for more certain in those ways of being,
mm,
and then giving that to others.
mhm,
um, on like a separate note, like outside of myself, I just have dealt with that language being like co-opted in different spheres
mm,
so often, especially in like institutions, that sometimes like it's not a word that I personally use,
right,
you know?
yeah,
It's not, it maybe it used to be, but then it became something else now that it's been taken up so often by
mm,
people and places that don't really understand what it is.
mhm,
Yeah, so often it's a band-aid solution or a
mm,
territory acknowledgement or
right,
hiring like an Indigenous person for like a summer or whatever.
yeah, it's fleeting.
It's fleeting, yeah.
Fleeting. I really, really appreciate exactly what you're talking about. And it's exactly the reason why you've inspired me so much is the authenticity of your nature, but the authenticity of the way that you write and that you paint, and how difficult it is to actually articulate that authenticity. It's more of an energy that I think that encompasses your work, encompasses your writing and your persona and the way that you tattoo. I mean, I follow you on Instagram, so I see some of the things that you respond to being very critical, especially I think in the waves of criticizing institution and some of your experience, but also really coming with that self-determined practice, that really embodies that governance of Anishinaabe worldview. And just maybe one other kind of reflection, if people don't know you or your work, but some of the ways that um, youth have really benefited or have been encouraged by you as a facilitator, as a leader. You want to talk a little bit about the youth work and what compels you and keeps you there, and maybe an experience where you were really able to see that fruition or that internal validation that you're offering, I think, the youth to also say, you know, you don't have to be validated by an institution or something external, but we have the power to really self-love and be in this place of self-acceptance. And do you have any experience or want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like as an artist or whatever, like the youth work that I do is really where most of my energy goes. And it's really the most important part of it all to me. Like, yeah, I just paint on the side and like write on the side, but most of my energy and time goes towards youth.
Yeah.
And for me, it was, yeah, like I tend to work with a really small group of youth every time and over a long period of time. And in it, it's an art program, but it's like approaching it from like an Anishinaabe understanding of art as a relationship and as like many relationships. So it's more so a program where we explicitly look at like relationship to ourselves, to our homelands, to our ancestors as part of artistic practice. And we look like explicitly at how colonialism has impacted those relationships.
Right.
So it needs a lot of space and intimacy and time. And it changes my life every time I run the program. It's really just, yeah. I guess the main thing I would want to share about it is that it is such a beautiful thing to work with Indigenous youth. I learned so much, but it is also really heartbreaking because all I do is create a space, and all I have to do is like make sure that space is safe and like tell them that I love them and like worlds are changed. And that's a really beautiful thing, but it's also a really devastatingly sad thing because it's just a testament to where we're at and these opportunities for young people to feel seen and loved, even just for a small amount of time, is not even something that is happening very often in our communities. So for me, yeah, that work is where my heart is for sure. That work informs my paintings. Like those paintings around my own body are deeply informed from the group of youth I was working with at the time at the Art Gallery of Ontario, who really pushed me to look at the ways I was extending myself outwards to protect them all the time, and you know, just saying, well, what happens if you just look at yourself too? So it's all really connected to me. It's all also a big responsibility. I feel a lot of tension now being pregnant and having my energy pulled somewhere else because that type of youth work, it doesn't just end. It's like constantly being pulled and caring for those same youth because I hold that responsibility. So there's like, yeah, a lot of tension and changes in myself recently around how much care I can enact, especially as I have like a newborn and stuff. But for me, yeah, that work, I don't know, I hope I articulate it in a way that shows how much I receive from that work. Like, it is my honor to do that.
It translates, you know, just even being an observer and a very distant observer from the youth work that you do. that does translate. And what I think really translates about the way that you work with the youth is the value system that you lay as a foundation. Like you're talking about time and intimacy, you know, and something that the institution doesn't offer. You know, there might be small cracks of time and space that you can cultivate the intimacy, but it closes up. And you know, the institution is like a machine, and it continues to pummel, I think, those opportunities for students. And I think especially students that want to do research or connecting with community work, you know, where that education can go outside of institution and really impact community. The values that I think that you work with the youth do translate. So I just want to kind of reiterate that as someone who kind of watches from an outside. And that care and that love, I think, are other values that are really important to talk about when we're talking about the type of work, body work, self-work, self-love. You know, it really, I think, encompasses a pathway for wholeness. And that's what I see about your work and about your style and just who you are as an artist and as a person. And I think those same, you know, thoughts around becoming a new mother, you know, that being a sacred action of creation. And so they're not they're not separate. And I really like how you talk about your worldview as being more of a holistic, like a spider web. There's lots of different moving parts all at the same time that informs that the way you are in the world, and it informs the way that you work with people. But also what I hear in the way that you're expressing yourself is the reciprocity that is built through these intimate relationships, that it's not one-sided, that you're also a learner and a teacher simultaneously as you're working with this youth. I think it gives great honor to the knowledge that youth have. And I think it acknowledges and bridges gaps that we have in our communities where youth don't have that opportunity. You know, within the arts, especially, I mean, even in my community, we have sports, you know, as that kind of place to cultivate and help our youth to self-actualize. And so I really do appreciate and support your vision for holding space for youth. I know that you guys are coming to a moment of exhibition soon for some of the work that has been created for youth. How are they feeling about having an opportunity to show that work, and what's that been like for you to witness this next phase and stage?
Yeah, it's been really cool, but also really hard because this program was just getting started when COVID happened.
Okay.
So I think we were in our like third week of working together and, you know, sitting in circle together. And then we just couldn't see each other ever again. And so if you can imagine this type of work being translated to a Zoom call, it was really challenging and really hard for me because I know that these conversations deserve such space and care and need that like physical relationship building to happen. But we continued on and like did the best that we could on Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's very different, but very necessary in a different way. You know, as everyone kind of is stuck at home and like not everyone has the best home situation and it's very stressful. I think to have an exhibition to work towards was really like a gift for a lot of the youth and a gift for myself too, to feel more connected during this time. So their show is, yeah, it's going to be launching tomorrow. It's an online exhibition.
Wow, right on.
Would have been at the Thunder Bay Art Gallery if COVID had not happened.
Right.
And yeah, we, you know, I think I got to impart a lot of the structural teachings around colonialism and like passing on those skills, but a lot of the circles that we would have had in basically like in ceremony, and like holding that ceremonial space was not possible. So
Mm-hmm.
um, this group is going to have the opportunity to do an in-person version as well, so kind of like doing the
Yeah.
program twice in a way.
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, it's just, that's kind of where my mind's been at a lot of the time too, is like, how do we make it more meaningful in the digital space for this type of work? Is it possible?
Right.
um,
Yeah.
just really tricky with this type of work where you can't, even for me, like I find Zoom calls so awkward. I'm not gonna
Yeah.
disclose really personal information in a Zoom call or cry or whatever. So
There's
it's
a certain amount of vulnerability that can't get translated.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is. So I'm very excited for the show, and like the artwork, just they unveiled it on Friday and it blew me away. It's
Wow.
so amazing. So
Mm. Is there a link that we can find for this exhibition? Is it open to everybody to see the work of the youth? I'm excited. Because I've been following some of the posts that you've been expressing about the youth, and I definitely would love to see the fruition of their hard work.
yeah, so the exhibition will be announced on their Instagram page, which is at Indigenous Youth Residency. Um, Two youth actually also functioned as the curators for the show, which is really cool too. So one of the curators is also like a web designer, so she's like currently building the exhibition page right now. So it will be live tomorrow, and we're going to try to get it out on as many avenues as possible,
Right.
so anyone can access it. And there'll be videos where the youth like talk about their work, and just different ways that we tried to make it more personable and more like you get to meet them and hear more about the work, considering you can't go to the opening and meet them in person.
Right. I think
Yeah.
that's so awesome, and I think it's also a big conversation that everybody is having. Even like in the performative theater world, it's all about how do we create this virtual world that we still feel like we're present to the work. And I think it's a lot of deep reflection and how that is even possible, if it's possible, when it's possible. How do we create the conditions to make that vulnerability still be alive within the virtual world? So I think we're all kind of in these complexities together.
Yeah.
um, and just in terms of you're carrying a baby right now. You're making a baby, and just through my own experience with being a mother and being an artist, I just wanted to let you know that, it's hard, but it's worth it. Like everything, where I grew up on reserve, and it was like, once you had a baby, it was like there was, you just stayed and raised your children in community and stuff like that. But I just wanted to really kind of share some words about, the power of children and the learning and the teaching that you do with your children, and how much you will see that will inform, the next journey in your life, the next teachings and phases that our children teach us. And I know, as you speak about having a really holistic practice and way of life, that um, and all of the work that you've done, I think there's been a trajectory of that self work, and even that the self portraits and learning to self love. You've cultivated a pathway for the next generation to be able to, see all of the beautiful and magical, gorgeous attributes and contributions that Indigenous women have made into society and into the art world. And your work speaks of that. I think visually, when I see your paintings, it helps me to love myself. So that same energy that you're putting into the work, it has a ripple effect. And that's why that I wanted to sit and talk with you and learn more about your process and who you are, and just to acknowledge, I think, you putting yourself out there in those vulnerable ways has helped women, especially, you know, at this time that we're advocating for murdered and missing Indigenous women, and the stories that have not been told, you know, those victory narratives that exist within all of us. We sometimes don't see that in the work, you know. We kind of see, you know, the trauma and impact, but sometimes the visibility of coming through to the other side isn't always expressed. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that, you know, acknowledge you as an artist and a contributor to this victory narrative that is so crucial for our young people to witness. And you've been that in my life, you know, even in the short time that I've known you and your work. You've given language to places where I didn't even have language. And that's why I really wanted to sit with you today. And you know, I don't want to take too much of more of your time. It's been an hour, and I know you're busy and you have this exhibition to um, to uphold, you know, that responsibility and accountability that you're talking about. I think as being a leader and facilitator and a holder of this space for youth. So I just wanted to say thank you, Nyal Goa, for your time. Is there anything that you want to close with, or any last kind of lingering thoughts about, you know, you or your process, your work, or
No, just thank you so much for having me. And
yeah.
um, it's, yeah, not lost on me that very first conversation we ever had where we met up, like,
Mm.
what, 5 years ago
A
now.
while back. Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah.
Wow. And how you really, yeah, you created space for me too when I was just, you know, struggling through school.
Mhm.
And yeah, you really helped me like break into youth work and have my first taste in what it means to interact with youth, and to also interact with the ways that we're supposed to interact with youth.
Right.
So I just want to bring that back full circle, and like how generous you were with me
Mm.
um, 5 years ago when you met me for coffee or whatever in the student room somewhere at UVic or whatever. um, that really matters in this world and matters to this work too.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, thank you so much for having me and for holding space for these discussions. And I'm really excited to see like the other discussions that you've been having. And
Nice. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm gonna end this recording, but I'll just kind of touch base right after that. So thank you everybody for tuning in. I hope there was information in there that you can really see in terms of the value systems and principles, and the importance of bringing those forward as you're teaching, as you're holding space for students. You know, this is right from our Indigenous worldview that, you know, people have generously been sharing, that I hope, you know, you're picking up on some of these teachings that you can implement or embody in your teaching work. So thank you to the audience who is listening. Okay, I'm just going to stop